Well, first of all, welcome to everyone. We appreciate you taking time on what we hope is a beautiful Saturday where you are to have this important conversation with us today. So I'd like to start out by, introducing myself and saying what the panelists about. Today's panel is titled "Disinformation Trends Community by Community." The right wing is busy sowing divisions in community of color. We've all seen that with very sophisticated information campaigns that are targeted and extremely effective. This takes the form of manipulative deep listening, appealing to base fears, all sorts of things that tend to divide communities. And so today, we're going to talk about how and where this is happening, how we can counter it, and more importantly, what we can do to reaffirm solidarity with affected communities. We're really excited today to be joined by three expert panelists in a conversation that I'll be moderating. My name is Marvin Randolph. I'm the president of Southern Elections Fund, which was founded by Julian Bond and Honest Communications. I've been an organizer for about 35 years, leading voting and organizing campaigns in 31 states, working with the Democratic Party, Service Employees International Union, Project Vote, NAACP, organizing director of community change and others. In the 2018 midterm, I managed over $17 million worth of independent expenditures across the nation in a role as a donor advisor to Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White. And the largest was a $7 million IE supporting Stacey Abrams' Georgia governor's race, and many other pieces of work that I've been doing in the 2020 election cycle. What's important, I think, about that experience is that so many of those victories in those elections were around how communities of color came together in a very powerful way. And so, part of what we're going to talk about is how these communities stay united and how we combat disinformation. Joining us are Gloria Pan, who is a senior advisor with Strategic Victory Fund and an expert on disinformation. Vanessa Cardenas, who's an organizer, communicator, and strategist extraordinaire around immigration, climate change, and women's empowerment. And Shireen Mitchell, who's the founder of Digital Sisters and Stop Online Violence Against Women. People should have gotten these bios in the description of the panel, but our format is going to be each panelist will spend 3 minutes introducing themselves and setting the frame for the conversation they want to have about disinformation in their community, what we need to be aware of, what we need to be prepared for, and how to combat it. We will then spend 20 to 25 minutes where I'll pose questions to the panelists to sort of guide a deeper discussion, to dive deeper around how this affects different communities and how collectively we come together to battle this. And we will leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end to take questions for the chat. So if you have specific questions, please place them in the chat and we'll make sure to address as many of them as we can. So we're about at 3 minutes. And I just want to start by saying, just to sort of set the frame as our panelists introduce themselves, if there is nothing that the right understood from the last couple of election cycles, it is that there are more of us than there are of them. When Black people, brown people, progressive white people, the Asian Pacific Islander community are united and not fighting for crumbs at the bottom of the table, we win. When we are divided, we lose. So a lot of what's happening right now, the type of disinformation, the type of confusion, is designed to divide us because they understand that math, elections are about math. If we unite instead of fighting for crumbs at the bottom of the table, we can grab the table and take it anywhere we want, smack it up, flip it, do whatever we want to it. So these panelists, I'm really proud that these sisters that are deep warriors in the movement are joining us today. And I'm going to start by turning it over to Vanessa to begin. And so Vanessa, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you want to talk about today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Marvin, for that introduction, and just really happy to be in this panel with these amazing ladies and really looking forward to the questions. I'm Vanessa Cardenas, and I'm senior advisor with the Strategic Victory Fund. And for probably the last 2 years, I have been working on disinformation. Last year, very much focused on the election, and this year, really monitoring, tracking, and just being part of a project that's really trying to help progressives with tactics and interventions to interrupt disinformation. In this panel, I'm going to talk about the disinformation that is targeting the Latino community. We know that, last year we saw disinformation across the board, but there was definitely an emphasis on reaching different ethnic communities, including the Latinx community. I know that we'll go deeper into the questions later on, and I'm sure that folks are going to have questions, but I just wanted to just make a couple of points. The first one is that, disinformation in the Latinx community has always existed. We always would hear radio spots, for example, that really gave the wrong information or misinformation about anything from immigration to sort of, elected officials at the local level, and so on. But I think what's different now is the fact that the platforms have really created this really damaging ecosystem where disinformation is being amplified in a way that it's completely out of control. And communities that are, I don't like to use the word vulnerable, but I think, in this instance, communities that are low information, that are, trying to make sense of what's happening around them are being targeted. So the volume of disinformation they're receiving is not just like the mainstream disinformation that we all see, but it's also disinformation that is being specifically targeted to those communities, many times amplified by bad actors that sometimes come from those communities, and it is in their language. And the other, I think, piece with the Latino community is they are not only getting the disinformation from the US, they're also getting this information from their home countries. So it's a really very vicious cycle where, they are really, they don't know whom to listen to. And to the extent that they're getting bombarded with disinformation and misinformation, it is definitely making an impact on them. So definitely sort of the environment that they're living and breathing is just, with this information, is just very specific to the community. I think the second piece that I want to highlight is just how the right is using this tactic and really just focusing on building its infrastructure to target Latinos. They have seen that this is a tactic that works. And also they are reaching these communities in the platforms where they are the most. I think as activists, as people that work mostly in the progressive movement, we tend to pay attention to Twitter. But we know that our communities are actually more on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram. And we have seen that the right really has built an ecosystem in those social platforms. And all of that is also being amplified by the ecosystem they have created offline. So radio, TV, local newspapers. So that whole infrastructure is really coming into play now, because they are, again, amplifying this information online and offline, and is creating a vicious cycle where, they are pumping out these types of themes or lies, just on and on. The last piece I will say before turning it over, I would say that, our solutions cannot just be focused on tools. Definitely, there are many tools in our toolbox. Part of it is a communications-driven sort of approach, but we also need to think. I think for me, the biggest lesson out of this is that we need to really ramp up, not just in our communication strategy, both online and offline, but also on an organizing and trust building. Because at the end of the day, these communities are going to listen to those who are closest to them, and leaders in their own community who they see day in and day out. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to you, Marvin.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate framing that up and hearing those powerful pieces of cautions, very healthy cautions and information about the community that you have such a deep relationship with. Let's move to our next panelist. Gloria, if we could have you talk a little bit about, tell people about who you are and what it is that that you want to talk about from this perspective of your community today.
Thanks, Marvin. Let me say that I'm extremely honored to be on this panel, especially with an old friend, Shireen, who whatever she says, I do, because she knows everything. And then new friend, Vanessa. I'm very glad to be here with you both. So my name is Gloria Pan, and I am a vice president of Moms Rising, where I lead the campaign to stop gun violence. Moms Rising, in case you're not familiar with us, is a multi-issue and intersectional national organization of more than 1 million moms and family members working together to build a country where everyone can thrive, including Asian Americans. So 60 years ago, there were fewer than 1 million Asians in the United States. Today, there are 23 million. About 95% of Asian Americans are immigrants or children of immigrants, and the vast majority of Asian Americans are at different places in our journey to becoming fully acculturated Americans. Furthermore, our community encompasses a dizzying diversity. We have members hailing from 50 countries and ethnic groups, and we speak more than 100 languages. This means that there are many nooks and crannies for disinformation to take root, something that divisive right-wing forces understand well and they're eager to exploit, especially now as Asian Americans are living in fear due to the surge in anti-Asian hate. We're vulnerable to disinformation around the issue of safety, and we're seeing too many viral videos of street violence against our community, and we're still reeling from the mass shootings in Atlanta and Minneapolis. So what does disinformation in the Asian American community look like? I am not a disinformation expert. There are many other people who know a lot more than I do in the Asian American community, but I do have some familiarity with disinformation from the NRA and the pro-gun community, which right now is explicitly targeting Asian Americans as a lucrative new market and also as potential recruits to their deadly right-wing political agenda. To be clear, everything that the pro-gun lobby says is absolutely false. But we're all familiar with messaging points like the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And we've also all heard that it's every American's constitutional right to bear arms. Lies, lies, all lies. And I could talk about that forever. But nevertheless, we are familiar with these things because they are very, very effective at communicating. These things prove how effective their messaging machine really is. So online groups and conversations about hate and violence against Asians are sprouting up everywhere. On Facebook, there are groups with names like Asian Americans United Against Violence and Asian American Alliance Against Racism, but these names are designed to mislead. The content is actually to promote the opposite. You'll see frequent sharing of street violence videos, almost always by Black or brown perpetrators, despite the fact that in reality, 3/4 of perpetrators are white. These videos are often accompanied by comments pointing out the race of the attacker, using labels like thug or criminal, followed by somebody then saying, well, that's why we need guns. So you'll also see admins complaining about how their posts are being suppressed, darn Facebook, and that everyone should follow them to a new social media network with no paid ads. And that's how I found myself in an account on MeWe, which is one of the new conservative social media networks. So now imagine these conversations happening, not just in English, but in Chinese and Korean and Vietnamese and Tagalog and other languages. And then also not just happening on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, but in closed communities like WhatsApp, or on platforms like WeChat for Chinese speakers or KakaoTalk for Korean speakers. Adding to this complexity is disinformation from outside the United States. First-generation immigrants may be swayed by perceptions of the US from their home country. And there is also evidence that foreign interests are also proactively reaching out to Asian American communities. Recently, the news media reported on a network of fake social media accounts linked to the Chinese government. Disinformation in the Asian American community is dangerous for many reasons. By its very nature, disinformation is intended to sow divisions and chaos. And this is something that we really cannot afford at a time when we need to pull together as never before to defend ourselves against the idea that we're not American and we have no place in this country. This disinformation can also have dangerous immediate repercussions for our democracy. Asian Americans are the fastest growing voter bloc. In the 2020 elections, Asian American turnout increased by double digits in almost every state except Alaska. In Georgia, thanks to the tremendous grassroots organizing, it increased by 500%, delivering the election results that change the balance of power that we see today in Congress. There are a number of Asian American groups doing their best to combat this disinformation, including Chinese for Affirmative Action, Viet Fact Check, Hannah Center, Toya Help, Indian American Impact, and also the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans are also just established an Asian American Disinformation Roundtable. But the effort is complicated and it's monumental, so help is needed. And that's why it's really imperative that the progressive community make Asian American engagement a top priority and join the fight to oppose and expose right-wing disinformation that right now has absolute free reign in the Asian American community. I just talked about Asian Americans, but clearly there are common themes in what's happening in other communities of color. And I'm looking forward to getting into it when we turn to the general discussion. Thank you.
And thanks so much, Gloria, and thank you for pointing out those very important statistics. Sometimes when we look at this new American majority that is winning elections, we don't study the numbers, and the Asian Pacific Islander community is the fastest growing demographic. I tell people all the time, don't sleep on the API community, and those numbers in Georgia were stupendous. So, thank you for walking through that. So, Shireen, walk us through a little bit about what you want to talk about today. Tell folks about the amazing work that you've been doing so we can dive into this great discussion.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad to be here. Of course, Gloria, you years of that, and Vanessa definitely in the fight. So I founded Stop Online Violence Against Women in 2013. The goal at that time was to focus on the harassment and targeting of Black women and women of color in general, and to have a very specific focus that we felt that was very different in terms of how they were being targeted, but also how the platforms were responding to those attacks. Fast forward, we were able to, from that moment, from accounts pretending to be Black women, from what was Donglegate before Gamergate existed, because the target was a Black woman, which is a strategic tactic that's been used with brigading and others that we, like most people now know. What we've been trying to say is that this has been happening, we've been seeing it, and no one's been listening. And in doing so, we were able to track all the way up to what was happening in the 2016 election, when we now know that the Russian interference the IRA targeted African Americans like no other group. We knew that first. We put out the first report about that. We had the data visualization that could prove this as evidence based on the 3,500 ads that were finally submitted to Congress. It was fascinating to then watch not only Facebook, but other groups then say, oh yeah, no other group was targeted than African American, but yet nothing to be done about it. So we started trying our best to define what was happening. We defined digital voter suppression so that people understood what that meant. We're still having a hard time for people to get that and understand that. But also in general, to have a sense of understanding that when certain communities are targeted, they're not just targeting us, they're using us as division for other groups. So Gloria kindly just gave you the stats on the Stop Asian Hate attacks, right? 3/4 were not Black people, but the majority of the content, even from the news, was showing clips of Black people harming Asians. That is not a mistake. That is not only the weaponization of the disinformation, because we've tracked that disinformation as well, but it's actually the weaponization of even media to participate in making Black people look like they're typically the victim, the criminals, and not the victims. So when there's a needed response, it's usually not from, to protect Black people. As a matter of fact, when hate crime has increased, the numbers, the difference between Asian and African Americans is 274 in total since 2020, and over 2,000 for African Americans. But yet we can't even get the anti-lynching bill processed in Congress, right? There's always some kind of stoppage going on there. And then that comes back to the community. And then there's more division that's being created after that. So what we're going to talk about today, as best I can, is not only how that division and that disinformation is using our content, our culture as a weapon, using our ability to speak up against this, and then also the way the platforms respond in reference to it. So examples like Kenosha, where we actually documented there were groups that were literally created and literally saying, shoot them all, i.e. shoot all the protesters who were protesting in Black Lives Matter. Facebook did not take those things down, but yet there was a incident in Kenosha where 2 people died. That kind of lack of reaction, but also the lack of concern that those platforms had, and many of those groups stayed up. We now know from the data of the whistleblower and other who has finally reported this out that they knew these troll farm groups existed pretending to be Black people and never did anything about it. They've known about it since 2016 when they were informed about the disinformation and the interference. And we've known since this time. We've yet to see any real responses from not only Facebook, but from other platforms in any way of defending us from this disinformation. So what we continue to do is track every topic that, whether it's talked about in the general population, how it's different for the Black community. A great example right now is CRT. I know most people are seeing this, people showing up at school boards. I need people to understand those are the cheerleaders that actually were targeting Ruby when she was trying to go to school during segregation. Same behavior, same actions, but somehow we're not getting that. What they want to do is remove the books like Ruby Bridges' story from the schools because they don't want that part of the history repeated or even identified. So we track where that's coming from, who's perpetrating it, which even the media outlets that are, and then the media outlets who are either not countering it, and or the Black voices who are trying to counter it, not being able to get the same kind of amplification and elevation versus the disinformation about us, towards us, and about us in terms of politics. We've been tracking every political disinformation campaign that's been targeting Black people, trying to get them not to vote, and telling them a whole bunch of other stories. So hopefully we can get through this, but my goal is to try to be as comprehensive as possible, that we have been tracking this for years and we have seen every pattern shift that has happened. Some of it's become a little bit more nuanced. Some of it's definitely more complicated with language, but I'll just say from a linguistics perspective, our AAVE is considered Turkish by the algorithms. So there's a lot to discuss here today, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to move forward.
Thank you so much, Shereen. And just, it was so powerful to hear you talk about how people take our content and our culture and prey on our basest fears and weaponize it in ways that divide us. And so it feels like, each of you have talked a lot about the very specific challenges in your individual communities and how people target you. Gloria, you talked about how people need to be aware of the fact that there's a diversity of language and culture that you have to be thinking about as you're messaging to your community, because we all know that messengers matter. Vanessa, you talked about some of the basest fears that people prey on to divide immigrants. Shereen, you talked about, how they use different cultures against each other to try to confuse and distort things. So if there's anything that I think that most of the people on this panel and that are listening to this discussion know, is that if the right read anything and paid attention to anything, they read the census. They know that there is a change that's coming, and they can't stop it, but they can pump the brakes. And how do they do that? By depressing, repressing, suppressing, and confusing the vote. So I would love to hear us talk a little bit more about how your individual communities can better work together so that you're addressing your unique problems and not allowing folks to pull us apart. Because if I were in a room full of people, I would have folks chanting, more of us than there are of them. We are the new American majority and we are growing, and we need to lean into that math. The other side, because they're attacking us, it's clear that they're leaning into that math in a really negative way. But I would just love to hear you guys talk a little bit about cross-community lessons, particularly if they're things that have worked with being aware of each other's struggles and being united as opposed to having us divided around these issues. I know there are no shrinking violets on this panel. Anybody want to dive in?
I will go first. Okay. Maybe I shouldn't have. I have to get my thoughts on her. All right. So let's just acknowledge, okay, first of all, that, racism and prejudice is not just like a white on everybody else thing. It exists within our own communities too. And as people trying to organize communities so that we all join together to work for something better for all of us. But we also have to acknowledge that there are problems in our own community that we have to fix. Okay. So having said that, I mean, within the Asian American community, I certainly do not pretend to speak for even a small percentage of our community, because we're Chinese, we're Korean American, we're Vietnamese American, we're Hmong American. But the one thing that I do want to point out is the fact that because we're such new Americans, we're figuring out how to be Americans. A lot of the vulnerabilities that we have towards, this disinformation and misinformation is also from like colonial roots, right? The imperialism of the United States, right? Ways that Americans were presented in army bases across the world, right? So that seeps into it. I mean, Japan has a really strong, has still very popular war culture, right? But the United States was very big there right after the war, and a lot of the prejudices and a lot of the framing and a lot of the racism that came from the United States out of that time, went to Japan and then maybe, influenced other countries and now bounces back to us. So all of these things are just so extraordinarily complicated. And so we have to be like mindful, because maybe the most important thing is to be mindful, because it's only when we're mindful that we can actually like work towards something. But the problem is that we're dealing with a lot of communities that are not mindful at all. They're just sort of accepting it. So I'll stop there and push back for other people, jump on.
So I will add to that. I think for me, last year was an example of how progressives, united and worked together to save our country. I mean, we won the election last year, and that was not an easy feat, as we all know now. Given sort of everything that was happening in the country, given Trump, given the disinformation machinery that they used. I think for me, and Shireen can probably speak more to this, but I think the Georgia runoff was also another example of communities working together in unison, coordinating, amplifying. And, one of the things that I was really proud of us was also just really focusing on driving our narrative. And I think one of the biggest lessons of last year was that we kind of understood early on that we were not going to chase every piece of disinformation out there, because that's actually a failed strategy. What we needed to do is drive our own messaging, drive our own messengers, and really just amplify that, right? Because that is a powerful tool of debunking disinformation. You have to lead your own narrative. I think that also, especially in Georgia too, having really validators and people on the ground and community leaders that spoke to those communities was another example of effective both organizing and communication, because those people were up front and center in sort of communicating to voters and really activating folks. So, there's definitely examples of, how we can work together to actually achieve power. I think the challenge is how to sustain it. And that's why when I, in my opening remarks, I talked about we can have all the tools in the toolbox in terms of tactics of disinformation, but at the end of the day, we need a long game. We need investment. We need programming in those communities, not just an election year. We need to always, be on the ground, building trust. And you don't build trust in 2 or 3 months. You have to be present in those communities to actually build trust in the long term. And I think there are many groups, from different communities doing this work day in and day out. And I think the challenge for all of us is to just, how can we support them?
And so for me, Vanessa, you're absolutely right. I would say that when we were tracking the disinformation, because we actually do have a report that led up to the runoffs, you could see the same kind of targeting, but what was different was the community also knew that disinformation had existed. They were taking in that as a part of the strategy, right. and there were multiple communities working on it at the same time. And to me, watching the two Ossoff and Warnock work together as well as a team made it even more powerful. So those are the types of examples, like for me, that like we have examples, we've done this before. honestly. We just seem to step back a little bit on the ways in which the disinformation is being spread. And I think that that has a lot to do with the way I think the sentiment of free speech. And that has allowed, in my opinion, that literally what happened in 2016 is that it was the weaponization of free speech. And we're still dealing with that. And we're still dealing with that in a framework that we're having a hard time trying to discern between opinions and facts, and being given and granted. Like, the media is just finally saying we need to stop saying things aren't lies. We have to stop these things that they were also participating in. They were putting disinformation talking points in headlines and sharing those headlines for clicks.